There is a story of America that many of us learn. America, land of opportunity, the nation of immigrants. That's the story we've been told for centuries. But here's the shocking truth. The very people we now call the founders of this nation were immigrants too. What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Shadows of History. If you're into jaw-dropping documentaries, epic deep dives into the past, and uncovering those hidden truths and untold stories, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, smash that subscribe button, hit like, and drop a comment down below. I love hearing what you think. Big shout out to all the new subscribers. Welcome to the family. And for my day ones, you already know. You're the real legends here. Alright, let's get into today's story. Trust me, this is one you do not want to miss. It often begins with brave explorers crossing a vast ocean. Before Columbus stumbled onto these shores in 1492, this land was already home. Between 50 and 100 million indigenous people lived across the Americas. In what is now the United States, there were more than 500 distinct tribes, speaking over 300 languages, each with unique cultures, governments, and economies. It speaks of founding fathers and a new nation born of revolution. Take Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis. Around the year 1100, this city was larger than London. Its people built massive earthen pyramids and traded goods across thousands of miles. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans engineered irrigation systems to farm in the desert. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, founded as early as the 12th century, built a sophisticated system of governance that would later influence America's democracy itself. This story is true in its own way, but it is not the whole story. It is a single chapter in a much larger book. To truly understand this nation, we must turn back to pages that came before. Far from being an untouched wilderness, this land was thriving with civilizations. Cahokia, near today's St. Louis, was once larger than London, with grand plazas and towering earthen pyramids. The ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings and irrigation systems that still amaze engineers. And the Haudenosaunee Confederacy developed a system of governance so sophisticated that it would later inspire elements of America's own Constitution. We must explore the unseen chapters that tell of a land already ancient and already home. Long before the first European ships. This is a journey into a deeper past that reshapes our understanding of the present. It begins thousands of years earlier. It is written not in ink on parchment but in the earth itself, found in silent ruins of great cities, in intricate patterns of ancient pottery, in enduring traditions of hundreds of distinct peoples. Before the United States, a continent teeming with life with diverse cultures, languages, systems of governance. To ignore this history is to see only a fraction of America. The land was not empty, it was inhabited by millions. These were the first Americans. Acknowledging their presence is the first step toward a fuller, honest story. One that begins not with arrival but with what was already here. Our exploration is not accusation, it is discovery. An invitation to see the familiar from a different vantage. Long before the names Plymouth or Jamestown entered the world's vocabulary, the North American continent was a mosaic of human ingenuity and culture. This was not a primitive or static world. But then came the immigrants, the Europeans, the Spanish in the 1500s, the English at Jamestown in 1607, the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620. They arrived as outsiders, immigrants searching for new lives. Yet unlike the immigrants who would come centuries later, these settlers didn't just join existing societies, they declared ownership. It was a place of constant change, innovation, and adaptation. From the dense forests of the east to the arid deserts of the southwest, hundreds of distinct nations flourished. They spoke more than 300 different languages, and with them came something else. Disease, smallpox, measles, and influenza spread faster than muskets or swords. Within a century, native populations in some areas had collapsed by as much as 90%. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, created a remarkable political alliance. Then came the immigrants. The Spanish in the 1500s, the English at Jamestown in 1607, the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620. They arrived as strangers seeking survival, freedom, and fortune. But unlike immigrants who joined societies, these settlers brought something different. The power to declare ownership. It was a league of nations bound by a constitution of peace, known as the Great Law, and with them came disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, illnesses. indigenous peoples had never encountered. In some regions, populations collapsed by as much as 90% in a single century. This confederacy established a system of representative governance that balanced local autonomy with collective security. Their society was matrilineal, with clan mothers holding significant political power, including the authority to select and depose chiefs. Farther west, in what is now the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built breathtaking cities carved into sheer cliff faces. Places like Mesa Verde in Colorado stand as monuments to their architectural and engineering genius. They developed complex irrigation systems to farm corn, beans, squash in a challenging desert environment. Their celestial alignments, intricate road systems which connected distant communities, reveal a deep understanding of both the earth and the sky. These were not simple villages, they were urban centers that were hubs of trade, ceremony, social life for thousands of people, lasting for hundreds of years. These societies were deeply connected to their environments, but they were not simply passive subjects of nature. They actively shaped the world around them. Through controlled burns, they managed forests to promote the growth of useful plants and create habitats for game animals. They domesticated crops that would eventually feed the entire world, including corn, potatoes, tomatoes. Their knowledge was not just spiritual or anecdotal, it was scientific, built upon generations of careful observation, experimentation, and passed-down wisdom. The continent the first Europeans encountered was not a wilderness, it was a managed landscape, a home that had been carefully cultivated for millennia. The story of America is often framed as a tale of settlement, but it is more accurately described as a story of successive waves of immigration. By the late 1800s, the policy shifted from removal to assimilation. Native children were taken from their families and forced into government boarding schools. Their hair was cut, their languages silenced, their names erased. The motto was clear: kill the Indian, save the man. The arrival of Europeans beginning in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was one such wave. In just a few centuries, indigenous peoples had gone from being the first inhabitants to being treated as outsiders in their own homeland. These newcomers were, by every definition, immigrants. As the colonies grew, so did hunger for land. The United States expanded westward, driven by the belief in manifest destiny, that it was the settlers' God-given right to take the continent. But for Native Americans, this meant displacement, death, and betrayal. They were people leaving their homelands behind in search of something new: wealth, religious freedom, a chance to escape the rigid social structures of the old world. They were not settling an empty land, they were entering a continent already inhabited by established nations. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, forcing tribes from the southeast to move west of the Mississippi. Their arrival marked not the beginning of America's story, but the start of a new and often tumultuous chapter. The first Europeans were foreigners on a foreign shore. They depended heavily on the knowledge and generosity of the indigenous peoples they met. Native Americans taught them how to cultivate unfamiliar crops like corn, how to navigate the dense forests and winding rivers, and how to survive the harsh winters. Without this crucial assistance, many of the earliest European colonies would have almost certainly failed. Jamestown, Plymouth. They were immigrants relying on the established residents. This perspective shift is simple but profound. It reframes the entire narrative. If we see the English, Spanish, French, Dutch not as founders of a new world but as immigrants arriving in an old one, our understanding changes. The subsequent history is no longer a straightforward story of taming a wilderness. Instead, it becomes a complex story of cultural encounter, negotiation, and conflict between a long-established population and a new group of arrivals. It places the European experience within a much larger context, seeing it as one part of the continent's long history, not the beginning of it. By the late 1800s, the U.S. turned to assimilation. Native children were taken from their families and forced into government boarding schools. Their hair was cut, their languages banned, their names replaced. The motto was chillingly clear: kill the Indian, save the man. History becomes a shared space, a story of many peoples meeting on the same land. In just a few centuries, indigenous people had gone from being the original inhabitants to being treated as strangers on their own land. Many Americans are familiar with the Aztec and Inca empires, but few learn about the great civilizations that rose and fell within the borders of the modern United States. Perhaps the most stunning example is the city of Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis. And yet, despite everything, despite centuries of colonization, removal, and erasure, native peoples endure. Today there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, with many more fighting for recognition. Languages once declared dead are being brought back to life, sacred lands are being reclaimed, and native leaders are reshaping national conversations on sovereignty, climate change, and justice. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was actually larger than London at the same time. It was a sprawling urban center with a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000. Its inhabitants built more than 120 massive earthen mounds, some used as platforms for temples, some used for elite residences. The largest of these, Monk's Mound, stands 10 stories tall and covers more than 14 acres at its base. Cahokia was the heart of the Mississippian culture, a network of communities across the Midwest and Southeast. The city featured a grand central plaza, covering nearly 50 acres, used for public ceremonies, used as markets, and used for games. Archaeologists found evidence of a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. A series of large wooden posts called woodhenge tracked solstices and equinoxes, likely for agricultural purposes and for ceremonial purposes. This was not a scattered collection of huts, but a planned city with a complex social hierarchy, a powerful political structure, and a vibrant cultural life influencing the region for centuries. The existence of Cahokia challenges the myth of a primitive, sparsely populated North America. It proves large-scale societies with monumental architecture and complex social structures existed long before European contact. Cahokia was not alone. Other major centers included Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia, each with impressive mounds and plazas. These sites are silent witnesses to a forgotten chapter of American urban history, when cities built of earth, not stone, dominated the Mississippi River Valley. The reasons for Cahokia's decline around 1350 remain debated: environmental degradation, climate change, political instability, and disease. But its legacy endured. Traditions, symbols, and social structures of the Mississippian culture were carried on by descendants, peoples who later encountered European explorers such as the Natchez and the Creek. Unearthing Cahokia is like discovering a lost civilization in our own backyard. It forces us to reconsider the depth and complexity of the continent's history before 1492. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas triggered one of the most profound demographic upheavals in human history. It was not simply a matter of a few ships arriving on the coast, it was the collision of two separate biological worlds that had been isolated from each other for millennia. The most devastating consequence of this encounter was the introduction of old-world diseases to which native peoples had no immunity: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. These epidemics swept through the continent with terrifying speed and lethality. These epidemics were an unintentional yet catastrophic consequence of the Columbian Exchange. The scale of the population collapse is difficult to comprehend. While exact numbers are impossible to know, modern estimates suggest that in the century following first contact, disease may have wiped out as much as 90% of the indigenous population in some regions. Entire communities vanished, languages were lost forever, vast networks of trade and knowledge collapsed. This was not a battle won on a field of combat. It was a biological catastrophe that hollowed out the continent long before significant numbers of European immigrants began to move inland. The empty lands that later settlers encountered were often not empty by nature, but had been recently emptied by plague. Simultaneously, a massive wave of migration from the Old World began and grew over centuries. In the grand scope of the continent's human history, this was a sudden and enormous influx. By the time of the American Revolution in 1776, the immigrant and descendant population in the 13 colonies had grown to about 2.5 million people. A century later, following waves of immigration from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe, the U.S. population had swelled to over 50 million. This rapid demographic shift fundamentally and permanently altered the social and political landscape of North America, marginalizing the continent's original inhabitants in their own homeland. Understanding this dual demographic story, the catastrophic decline of the indigenous population, and the explosive growth of the immigrant population is essential to understanding American history. It contextualizes the conflicts over land and resources that would come to define centuries of interaction. It was not a story of a large group of newcomers overwhelming a small group of natives, and yet despite everything, despite centuries of colonization, forced removal and erasure, native communities endure. Today there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. and many more still fighting for recognition. Languages once declared dead are being revived. Sacred lands are being reclaimed, and native leaders are reshaping conversations on sovereignty, climate, and justice. It was, in many places, a story of a growing immigrant population moving into lands that were once home to thriving societies that had been shattered by forces they could neither see nor fight. This is a crucial, if somber, part of the American narrative. The story of America is, in the end, the story of a place that has been discovered and rediscovered time and again. A home, a destination, a refuge, a battleground. So the next time we say immigrants built this country, let's remember. The first immigrants here weren't the ones arriving at Ellis Island in the 1900s. They were the white settlers who came centuries before. Immigrants stepping onto lands already alive with nations, traditions, and history. The first journey was made across the Bering Land Bridge thousands of years ago, leading to the rise of 100 civilizations. Much later, another journey began across the Atlantic Ocean, bringing new peoples with new ambitions and new ways of seeing the world. And after them, countless other journeys from every corner of the globe would follow, each adding another layer to the story. To see America only through the lens of the last few centuries is to stand at the mouth of a great river and mistake it for the source. The nation's history runs much deeper. It flows from the ancient cities of the Mississippi Valley, from the cliff dwellings of the Southwest, and from the political genius of the Iroquois Confederacy. It is a history that was written in the stars and on the land long before it was written on paper. The European immigrants who arrived were not stepping into a void. They were stepping into a history already in progress, becoming part of a story that was much older than their own. This understanding transforms our perception of the American identity. It suggests that being an American is not about tracing one's ancestry to a single group of founders. Instead, it is about participating in an ongoing narrative of arrival and encounter. Whether your ancestors walked across the land bridge, sailed on the Mayflower, were brought here in chains, or arrived on a plane last week, you are part of this continuous story. This perspective unites us not in a shared origin, but in a shared geography and a shared, complex history on this specific piece of land. Therefore, the invitation is to see America as a land of many arrivals, not just one. It is to listen for the echoes of all the journeys that have crossed this continent. When we do, the story becomes richer, more challenging, and ultimately more complete. It is a narrative that is still being written, a conversation between the past and the present that includes every voice. It is the story of a nation that is not defined by a single beginning, but by the multitude of paths that have led us all here, to this shared place, at this moment in time. A story that belongs to all of us, and it is still unfolding today. Recognizing that our national story is woven from the threads of many different pasts. To truly honor America, we must honor those who were here first, and never forget that the story of this land is far older and far deeper than the one we were taught in school. So the next time we say, immigrants built this country, remember, the first immigrants here weren't the ones at Ellis Island or crossing modern borders. They were the settlers who came centuries ago, stepping onto lands already full of nations, culture, and history. To understand America, we must face this contradiction, and to truly honor America, we must honor those who were here first.